Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Quite a few policymakers and regulators this morning been speaking on the RMB Offshore Center. I guess all of you know the broad framework. Now, what's the difference between my speech and theirs is that I will speak on everything that they cannot speak. They're not allowed to speak on certain things, not willing to speak on certain things, or they disagree with me. So that's everything I will be talking about in the next 20 minutes, and then probably 5-10 minutes for some discussion. Now let me start with a couple of points on why the central government in China are really interested in doing this internationalization of RMB. This is the backdrop of the entire discussion of Hong Kong as an offshore RMB center. Couple of conditions based on sort of research by historians that will make a currency, the internationalized currency, or eventually reserve currency. Number one, this currency has to be a pricing currency, which means that if you trade oil and other commodities, pricing is done in your currency. And secondly, a settlement currency. For example, international trade, imports, export, settled in your currency. And finally, reserve currency. Obviously, US dollar is the strongest and biggest international currency for now. And China wants to challenge that. You probably remember back 1.5 years ago, the Chinese Central Bank Governor Zhou Xiaochuan, he made a statement, a pretty shocking statement by that time. He said SDR should replace the US dollar. And it wasn't understood by lots of people on the market. And the press, I think, from the US and Europe were basically saying China wants to be nasty against the US. And I understand better because I know these guys very well. The real story or real thinking behind this perceived challenge to the US dollar is that they think, I think people in Beijing are thinking that the US dollar dominance in the global reserve currency system is one of the culprits for the global financial crisis. Why do I say that? Because the dollar is a pricing currency, it's a settlement currency, and it's a reserve currency. Most global reserve managers have very few choices but to invest in US dollar denominated assets, especially buying US dollar bonds, which means that everybody wants to lend to the US, and therefore it's too easy for the US to borrow because funding cost is too low for them. And as a result, the US is borrowing too much, and therefore they invest too much, they consume too much, they end up in this subprime crisis, which inflicts costs on everybody in the world, bigger costs. Just take S&P as an example, it was down 50% during the crisis. The Chinese Asia index was down 80%, Hong Kong as well. How do we avoid that in the future? We need to undermine the US dollar dominance in the global reserve system by replacing that with something else. What are the feasible choices for now? That's SDR for the moment. It's just a weighted average of a few bigger currencies. But in the longer term, it's going to be RMB. Again, going back to historians' work, they say you need two conditions for a currency to become a reserve currency. Not necessarily sort of a sufficient condition, but these are the two necessary conditions. Number one, your country has to have a very big GDP number. Number two, you need to have a very big trade number. Let's look at these two charts. This is the first number. Based on my forecast, the Chinese GDP measured in US dollar will be bigger than that in the US in 12 years' time, 2022. How do I do that? Very simple. I assume Chinese real GDP growth will be 7% per year in the next 12 years, inflation 3% plus 3.5% currency appreciation against the dollar annual average basis. And you end up with something close to 15% annual average growth of Chinese GDP. And the US, I'm assuming about 4% nominal GDP growth. That's where we get this crossing in 2022. The next chart says in 6 years' time, the Chinese total trade, imports plus export, will be bigger than that with the US. So we're even faster on this front in terms of trade. And trade settlement will be creating one of the aspects of the RMB internationalization. So we have these two physical conditions ready. And what else we need? We need convertibility. Now we don't have to have full convertibility. In the process towards convertibility, we can already create demand for Chinese currencies. And along the way, we can allow the Chinese currency to become a reserve currency, initially maybe starting from 0% of the global reserve system towards 1% in 5 years' time, 5% in 10 years' time, maybe 20% in 20, 30 years' time. And the real interesting part is this convertibility. Now, a couple of things that's been discussed, I think, very extensively over the last 1.5 years, largely in Beijing, on whether we should do that, whether we should do this internationalization, and what are the benefits, what are the costs, and whether the benefits outweigh the costs. Now, here are basically what I've been sort of taking stock of these debates over the past 1.5 years. I think the first 2 or 3 are very sort of tangible benefits. Number one, if RMB becomes international currency, it's used as pricing and settlement, we can reduce the transaction and hedging costs for Chinese importers and exporters. This is pretty straightforward. You don't have to convert to US dollar and convert back and buying all these forwards and swaps and so on. The second thing, which is probably more interesting, is Chinese outward investment in other countries. For example, China wants to invest in Africa, 100 billion, 200 billion US dollar, in the mining sector or in the infrastructure sector. But the money that Chinese invest in Africa are essentially all going to be channeled back to China to buy Chinese goods. For example, the Chinese railway equipment, power equipment, telecom equipment, and they will use Chinese ships and they'll be using that money to hire Chinese workers to do the construction work. So why do we need to do this in US dollar? Right? If we avoid this conversion to dollar back and forth, we can also reduce transaction hedging costs for Chinese ODI as well. There are lots of other benefits I don't think I have time to really run through in terms of synergy tax, funding costs, and so on. On the cost side, there are serious concerns, and I think it's still sort of lingering around. One of them is that once we have convertibility, exchange rate is going to be more volatile than before, whether the system, the economy and the financial system in China can withstand these kind of shocks. And secondly, whether the inflows and outflow of capital is too large, and whether our system are ready to really deal with the consequences of inflows, big inflows and big outflows. And finally, monetary policy transmission mechanism may have to change. The current mechanism is that they target a money supply, for example, M2, which is set, for example, 17% last year, maybe 16% next year. But this mechanism will no longer work in the internationalized currency environment, because after internationalization or convertibility, demand for RMB is unpredictable. A lot of people like you guys will hold RMB, and the need or demand for RMB could be 1% of total money supply, could be 5%, and therefore setting a money supply target is no longer workable in this new environment. You have to switch towards a interest rate targeting mechanism. That's another challenge. Internally, the reform has to be really coordinating with this internationalization process. But I can only tell you the conclusion. After all these debates, the benefits outweigh the costs, and there is a serious commitment at the very senior level that we want to push internationalization. And with that as a backdrop, we've been seeing quite drastic developments over the past year, and I think we will continue to see that in the coming years. Now, the most important development last year or so with this RMB trade settlement expansion from a couple of cities in China to 20-something cities and provinces, and also internationally, the RMB trade settlement expanded from a couple of regions in Asia towards almost all major places in the world. As a result, the RMB deposits in Hong Kong has risen drastically. It's growing almost like 100% every 3 months, and I think will continue for the next couple of quarters, and will probably slow down a little bit towards later part of next year. But nevertheless, this momentum is very, very strong.